Welcome to the Future of Less Work, where we're exploring how work is changing one conversation at a time. I'm Nirit Cohen, and today's episode is about something we don't often name, but we all feel: angst. Not burnout, not disengagement, not quite quitting, but a deeper, harder to pin down sense that something's off, that work just isn't working the way it should. My guests today, Dr. Erin Eatough and Dr. Shonna Waters, co-founders of the research and advisory firm Fractional Insights, argue that we've been measuring the wrong things, reacting to the wrong signals, and missing the root cause of underperformance, attrition, and apathy, the growing gap between what people need and what work actually delivers. We'll explore their concept of Angst Index, why engagement surveys don't tell us nearly enough, and how leaders can start designing work that actually meets the human needs, even as technology is transforming the way we work. Because if AI is faster and cheaper, we need a better answer to the question, why do we still need humans at work? And maybe more importantly, what kind of work should humans be doing? Erin, Shonna, welcome to the Future of Less Work.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for joining me. And I actually want to start with a question about the name of your firm, Fractional Insights. It's so specific. What's the story behind that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It comes from a few different places. One is a nod to the fractional movement, which, if anyone isn't familiar with that, it's basically a move to have executives join a company in a part-time role, but still having the accountability for a full function like you normally would. And it's helpful for companies that are earlier stage and maybe don't need a full-time role or can't afford a full-time role.
Yeah, we know like the concept of a fractional CMO, fractional, CFO. So the people that come in because you want a senior person, but you can't afford to, or maybe don't even need to pay for full-time.
Exactly. And so Erin and I met at a company called BetterUp, where they had very early on invested in building an in-house lab. And we saw firsthand how helpful that was in really growing the business and the product. And we thought, man, wouldn't it be great if every company could have access to a lab? And so we combined those concepts and said, Fractional Insights is sort of a fractional lab model and in part of it. And then the second nod is really towards evidence-based practice, where it recognizes that empirical data is a really important part of the picture and how you should make decisions in business, but it's not the full picture. So there's the extant literature, there's data that you have internally to your organization, there's stakeholder perspectives, and then your own expertise as a professional and consultant. And so it's also the recognition that any one insight is just a fraction of the full picture.
So thank you for that. That's actually fascinating. When I connect the dots here, right? You're basically saying we're doing the research, right? We have all this data. So from everything that you are possibly looking at this intersection of where things are today with people and work and jobs and learning and skills and capabilities, how did you land on angst or the Angst Index, even as something that you is worth pursuing?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons that we decided to start this business to begin with was because we were noticing and recognizing a monumental transition phase that is upon us. And one thing we know from being, experts in organizational psychology, but also coaches, is that change really opens up an incredible opportunity for growth and reinvention, but that often comes with a deep sense of discomfort. And generally, people are a bit fearful when change happens because it threatens our basic needs. And so we were noticing that both in the clients we were serving, in our own professional network, and wanting to really bring voice and data and insights to this so that organizations can go through these monumental transitory phases with the information and insights that they need to make that really successful.
So we used to talk about change management models. We actually talked about the value of fear, right? This idea that you go through this phase. I wonder why naming that fear and maybe putting data in on it, right? Why that matters. What does that do to what or what leaders might do otherwise than they wouldn't do without it?
Yeah, I think the naming it is a critical step for a number of reasons. First of all, even psychologically, we know that by naming the emotion we're in, we actually create the distance between ourselves and that emotion. So it gives us a more space to be able to respond instead of react to it. So there's a really foundational instrumentality in just naming something. So that felt sense of angst that, as Erin said, we were noticing across the board. Once we started calling it angst, it seemed really resonant. People were like, yes, that's it. That's what I'm experiencing. Now I can see it. Now I can act on it and do something with it. And so I think that's where a lot of our work was trying to say, okay, if we have this felt sense that it exists, we can provide a name to it. That allows us to start conducting research on it and then getting a lot more prescriptive about what you can do to actually address it.
So what have you learned about what's causing it? Because I'm thinking, the conversations we're having these days with leaders, technology's coming in, leaders are saying we don't need all those people. Maybe people are losing their jobs or they can't get hired. Okay, there's fear in the system, but what are you telling me in the organization that I can do something about that I couldn't do before you named it and maybe learned how to measure it?
Yeah, well, foundationally, if you think about the ultimate business objectives for really any organization, at the very top of a pyramid, you might think, or a iceberg is a metaphor we like to use, but is really driving the business forward in terms of revenue and value creation for the world. Underneath that, organizations often think about their organizational performance. Underneath that is their talent performance or their human capital performance. And collectively, we've gotten to a place where we're now able to measure things slightly below the surface that we can't often see in our KPIs or objectives that you might review in functions. And
Like
that's
the
things
root
like
causes.
well, things like engagement. Like we've gotten to the place where we have recognized the importance of things like job satisfaction. And then we evolved even from job satisfaction to something more robust, like the engagement of your workforce. But what Shauna and I are identifying is that there are three core human needs that nearly everyone universally has. And those are the needs for security and safety, for growth and development as a human, and then for feeling like you matter, you're significant, and there's meaning and purpose in the activities and the work that you're doing. And if we can start to identify the root cause challenges that are eroding individuals' sense of being able to fulfill those needs, we even can predict a layer lower than engagement. And that helps organizations start thinking about how they're going to actually redesign their human capital systems as they are transitioning to a very different model of work in a way that addresses the foundational needs that will cascade all the way through to your business outcomes.
Yeah, and that's what actually got me excited when I was looking at your data on you and some of your research you published. You talk about 3 out of 4 people have a gap in between their needs and the workplace reality, and we know that engagement is suffering. In fact, it's been suffering a really long time. I don't think we have figured out what exactly we can do. And going one layer below helps us maybe even personalize the solutions, not just understand how to design them.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
That's right. The more we can understand those root cause factors and think about how to design systems, not just in silos. So, for example, if you have an understanding that there is a lack of security in your organization and people are feeling a lot of angst around that, you might make decisions around compensation or development, even in terms of career progression. But really, if you want
Yeah,
to
or
solve
simply
that.
communicate often. We know that during COVID, we had, you know, no security, um, in a lot of levels, right, of very basic levels, and we talked about organizations communicating very often, even about what you know, even if you don't know a lot of things, and promising to circle back tomorrow, and that addressed some of that angst.
Right. Yeah. And that's exactly the line of thinking that we recommend organizations go down is you can map different components of your people systems onto like what are these levers that we have available to either create or resolve angst for our employees. So as an example, I think security is a great one, right? So, what are the ways that we can, as a company, increase security even when it's in question? Compensation is one. You know, there's the base salary and benefits and all of those financial security aspects. But as you're saying, communication would fall into like, what's your transparency framework? What is the way that you share information about your policies and the way that you make decisions? There's risk management and fairness that ends up coming into play when we're thinking about how safe and secure do I feel in an organization. And then even things like what organizational psychologists call procedural justice. It's like actually people can understand a lot of different outcomes, but the way you make a decision is really critical. So feeling like I understand how it's done, I feel good that I'm given a fair shot in that process. And then ultimately, things like culture, what's happening in our culture that makes me feel like I have to close in versus open up. So by going through and saying, like, if we see a high level of the angst of insecurity in our culture, what are the things that are happening and what are the control mechanisms I have available to me to resolve that, given that, you know, our data shows such a strong relationship to things like turnover and performance and you know all these things that we care about we want to minimize even if all we care about as Erin said is that top of the iceberg in terms of organizational performance.
Erin, have you seen this being put in practice in a way that's memorable to you that you said, okay, this is somebody who's actually maybe an HR or a leader who's actually implemented this perspective to get a different result?
Yeah, we've seen this implemented really effectively across several organizations. One organization that comes to mind right away is one of the Tony Hsieh Award winners, and we were privileged to be a part of supporting the Tony Hsieh Award this year, and so got to learn a lot about. This particular company. And this company called Menlo Innovations is really doing things quite differently as they approach their people strategy and their human capital strategy from things like radical transparency, where not only does everyone know exactly what everyone's salary is, but it's posted on the wall in the office for the highest level of even physical visibility of what stage each individual is at. So there are lots of examples like that too in terms of navigating AI transformation and doing that in a way that is conducive to creating the meeting of human needs, especially in AI, AI transformation issues. So Mayo Clinic was also one of
Like
the
what? What
um,
would be a good example of that? Because that one's definitely very angst provoking these days.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Mayo Innovations is one example of that, where what they did at Mayo to bring AI in was they actually, in the nursing organization, they had all of the nursing staff invited to consider how AI might make their work better and work together at the lowest level on the frontline nursing staff to identify the places in their daily experience and process where AI could be really beneficial to them. And that was putting the agency and autonomy back in the hands of the ultimate end user. From that strategy or that approach, the nursing organization was able to identify many different use cases for AI, design new AI products for their organization, specifically to solve pain points that nursing staff have had for years and years and years. And not only that, they created patents from this. So not it was a massive success, one that of course got external recognition as well. And what was foundational about that approach was that it really offered agency, autonomy, participation, and treated individuals as experts in their own domain and roles for being the voice and the generator of the ways in which AI would be applied.
Yeah, that's a fabulous example. We also know that it's scariest when it happens behind closed doors and you always imagine the worst. And so you're basically, putting in the hands of people and obviously creating the right solution. So, Shauna, I know you have this concept called the psychological ergonomics, which I really want to hear more about.
Yes, thank you for asking. Yes, psychological ergonomics is, sort of an outgrowth of if you think about physical ergonomics. And what that does is it aligns our environment, our physical systems to our bodies. And we know, that works well because when the monitor is at the wrong height or our keyboard's not in the right location, we experience physical pain and that gets in the way of our productivity. So we've known that for decades, and there's a lot of supports offered in organizations to help you right size the physical ergonomics of your environment. But the way that work has evolved over time, with knowledge work becoming so dominant, that actually some of the biggest risks in many of our environments today are actually psychological. This is why things like engagement and burnout and everything have gotten so much attention. And so psychological ergonomics is really describing a process for aligning our contexts and our workplaces and our jobs to meet our psychological needs in
How?
addition to our physical needs.
How?
This is really about doing exactly what we've been talking about through this. Well, it's recognizing that while our environments change, humans evolve far slower. And so these fundamental human needs, psychological needs that Erin has been describing in terms of security, growth, and significance, are pretty invariant across people. And we look to work to get those met. And so we can go through this process of really auditing the jobs and the systems, the policies, the processes, and say, where are we experiencing friction in our organizational environment, just like we would if our monitor was at the wrong height, and really redesigning consciously with those things at the center.
So, for example, if we take another one like growth, right? Growth and development. And
Mhm.
we know that that's almost like a psychological need because it's connected to security, because I know that my ability to stay employed is connected to my ability to stay relevant. And I know that no one's going to spoon feed me everything I will need to know in a
Right.
couple of years, or maybe even a couple of months. So I need to own this, right? If I'm working for a manager with a full-time day job and um, no one's giving me any space, budget, or time, or ability to focus on learning the things I will need for tomorrow, that causes angst, right? And your
Exactly.
assessment can basically surface the fact that that's a problem for this particular individual.
Right. Or even at a systems level. I was recently at an organization giving a talk, and they are, like many of us, in the process of trying to drive mass AI adoption. Well, the challenge is that the environment really prioritizes operational efficiency, speed. Well, the dirty secret about learning anything new is that it actually causes a dip in performance at first while we go through the learning curves and we realign our processes and all of that. And so, I think sometimes it's that short term pain that leads to the long term gain. And we know that, from all the work on change and everything, that curve keeps going up and to the right, but only after you get through that initial dip. So, yes, there's some individual work that has to be done there to say, like, I really just need to bite the bullet and take the time and invest the energy and resources to do that. But also, how are we creating that space, reinforcement, incentives, managerial support, peer support to be able to do this collectively where we're reinforcing and incentivizing the behavior we want as a system too, that yes, feeds that growth, those growth needs where it's like, I want to be my best self. I want to feel like I'm growing, learning both for my security and just for, my own, feel like I'm making meaningful progress, but also because the organization needs me to.
Yeah, I go back to the idea that you're naming this because I'm putting my HR hat on. We know, right, that people are worried about their jobs right now. We know that there isn't enough time to learn everything you need to learn. Um, it's kinda you get that sense, right? But it's not a hard data point. The hard data points are usually lagging indicators. They're turnover or, the inability to hire what you need, something about skills gap. Maybe if we're lucky, we can put numbers on those. So there's something about the ability to basically say, "This is going to show up on turnover or show up on lack of engagement because here's what people are worried about. Let's treat it early." Is essentially what you're saying.
Yes. Yes, and to go one step further, and this is work that Erin did. We also looked at poachability, which I think to your point on what is a lagging indicator. We actually found that traditional measures of turnover are underestimating significantly what the real risk is when people aren't getting those basic core needs met. And that's because when our security is threatened, we actually cling even more tightly onto our current situation. But if your needs for growth and significance aren't getting met, your need for security isn't getting met, another opportunity comes in, and your best candidates are the ones who are at highest risk of being poached. They will leave because they have that really innate sense of, I want more, I want better than this.
Yep. So Erin, if I'm a CHRO listening right now, what's the first thing I should do differently?
Yeah. Well, I think the first step is really the diagnosis phase. It's getting a sense in your organization of where those, as Shauna said, friction points lie, where there are hot spots in terms of angst and unsettledness that create business risk, and starting with the insights necessary to then take the action. And one of the reasons why I'm saying that that's a really important first step is because what we've seen in the data is that there is a massive disconnect between CHROs, CEOs, executive leadership who are in the seat of power and in the seat of decision making over organizations and change. There's a massive difference between how they see the opportunity for AI and what that's going to mean for the organization, for the experience of work, for the betterment of themselves and their jobs, and the lens and perspective with which managers even have. Even further gap and more pessimistic is the front lines. And that's because the closer you are to power and authority, the more inherent knowledge in terms of like intelligence about the business and decision making and authority, and legitimate power that you have over some of these decisions and how they get made. Further away from that, the less control, the less visibility and understanding you have, and the more there is this very deep sense of angst and worry and fear about everything that's happening. But what's important to know about that is that if you're in a decision maker seat, your reality is fundamentally different than most of the other people in the organization who you are leading. And that's not always the case because we've also met lots of HR leaders who they themselves are trying to lead the organization through change, but are feeling very resonant with a lot of these ideas ourselves. But by and large, there is a massive difference between what the optimism level is and the perception of value of AI for the world and for self between hierarchical levels. And so, what I think that points to is back to what I was saying is the diagnosis phase and the bringing awareness, the revealing of the unseen undercurrents or the unaddressed pains that are being experienced in your organization, bringing that to the surface so that we can shine a light on them and then take action.
Yeah, and I think that, the ergonomics concept that you've introduced is basically to see it just does it's not that it has to be that way, right? And for a lot of years, we basically said, yeah, those of us sitting in front of computers, yeah, our hands will hurt, our necks will hurt. And then somebody came around and said, well, no, I can, design a different mouse for you or give you a different kind of keyboard or change the position of how you sit. And you're saying, well, because I think the text right now is AI is coming for your job. You're worried, that's a good thing, and I think you're saying, yeah, but we can understand what you can do to either communicate or make better decisions or, make time for growth and development, and realize that that's where the gap is, right? So the ergonomics is really interesting. Okay, awesome. So, I usually when we wrap up because this is this is this is all real-time things that everyone's worried about these days. I like to actually ask you for a question, not an answer. So, what do you think the question is that we should all be asking ourselves about the future of work these days?
Well, I think the question that Erin and I reflect on a lot that we would offer to the public as well is like, what is the future we want to create? I think the challenge and the opportunity with AI is that it is more powerful than any tool that we have seen in terms of being able to proceed with speed, power, and efficiency toward any goal you give it. And so that question of what is the goal is critical. In AI, we call that the alignment problem in organizations. We're used to like the challenge of what does good look like? What does success look like?
Yes.
And so I think we are at this, really pivotal inflection point in history where the answer to that question is going to have multi-generational impacts. And we're all in a position of a lot of power in being able to answer it.
So, Erin, I'm thinking with all the data that you have and the fact that you've actually been dealing with almost human emotion to this question and the fear that, I call this podcast The Future of Less Work because there's a lot of ways we could do less, right? I mean, less can be the fear less, right? The technology will take away our jobs and we'll be left with nothing and nobody needs us anymore. And it could be the good less. Yay, technology takes away a lot of the stuff I don't want to do and I get to do only the stuff I want to do and that's going to be great, right? So on the spectrum, um where do you think we're going? Or maybe
Yeah.
what do we need to do to go in the right direction?
Yes. Well, what you just touched on is something that Shauna and I are thinking about and talking about every single day. Essentially, the idea that we are currently sitting at a intersection or fork in the road between going toward utopia or toward dystopia. And we recently were at the TED conference in Vancouver and had the privilege of being around lots of very powerful leaders, in the world. And what I noticed, and the number one insight that I took away from that experience, was that there are very different viewpoints on where we are headed as humanity, as society, even to the foundation of whether the species of Homo sapien is going to survive this. And what I think is important about that is that there are a myriad of ways that we can go, and there is no consensus. And in particular, on the utopian version of the future, where we can spend our time doing the things that are generative and creative and that are only what humans can do, and all of the work that is brought upon, suffering and pain for humanity, we can allow outsourcing to robots and to AI. I love that version of the future. And I have yet to see a very clear plan that makes sense for how we would get there. Because what's happening right now is there's so many short-term decisions and decisions that are being made in silo for a particular organization. So for example, let's start swapping out people for AI. We'll get more efficiency. And that's fine in the short term, but ultimately, are these organizations even going to have a market in which they are able to successfully sell any products and services if we end up in a world where AI is doing all the work and all the humans are laid off?
Yeah,
We have to start.
yeah, totally agree with you. I think I have a keynote that I talk about the three possible scenarios, right? And organizations are doing, or rather leadership's doing what leadership has always done, which is we'll bring in technology, replace humans, do more with less. And if you take it all the
Yes.
way to the extreme, you get the billion-dollar company with no people, right? And then I ask them, but if AI does for you, for your customer, for your competitor, for your, supplier, everybody's using the same technology. And
Yes.
ultimately my agent's going to talk to your agent. And I don't know what we'll be doing in the meantime. At some point, we all look alike. And we're all wearing white t-shirts and somebody's going to say, well, I kind of like a pink t-shirt, and they'll handcraft it. And then we'll all look at that, say, hey, I want one of those. And then we'll start shifting back, right? To say, maybe we need to figure out what that extra element is that makes you you. Otherwise, we're all blank, right? So I totally agree
Yes.
with you.
Yes. I think that's totally right. And so, I mean, I think what I would, challenge us to consider more often and in our daily experience is the idea that we are all connected and part of a system. And so organizations, they need their people, but they also need their market. The whole thing works because we're a part of a system. And so we need to start having like the tough conversations as a society about what Shonna was pointing to, which is where are we headed? What is the goal? What do we want this to look like on the other side? How do things work? And what does that mean for the experience of people, for the prosperity and thriving of organizations, which we need for our economies and progress and problem solving? But what does that vision look like? And how do we reverse engineer the decisions that we're making today so that we are leaving behind a future that, first of all, exists and hopefully is better for the next generation?
Yeah, absolutely. Totally the right questions to be asking. Thank you, Erin and Shauna, for joining me today. To learn more about Erin, Shauna, check out the links in the podcast description. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to follow The Future of Less Work wherever you get your podcasts, and make it less in the context of the good less, right? Less of what you don't like to do. And remember, your best people do not work because they have to, nor because you tell them to, nor because you measure them on it. They work because they want to, because by working for you, they're achieving their own purpose in life. Till next time.